Good morning, everyone, or wherever you are. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the founding chair of the MA Curatorial Practice Program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And each week we have the Curatorial Roundtable. In fact, today is the last roundtable of the season. School ends in about a week. So I'm really happy to have Henrietta Huldish with us today. I'm going to read a short bio for Henrietta, and then I will turn it over to her for about 50 minutes, at which point, at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A, if you have a question or comment for Henrietta, that's where to type it. I will read the questions aloud, and that's the way it will go. So Henrietta joined the Walker Art Center as Chief Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs in 2020. Her shows at the Walker include Sophie Calle Overshare 2024 and This Must Be the Place inside the Walker's collection also last year. Previously, she was Director of Exhibitions and Curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. From 2010 to 2014, she worked as a curator at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. She began her career in 2001 at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where I remember her, working with our faculty member, Chrissy Isles. And at the Whitney, she co-curated the 2008 Whitney Biennial. Among her publications are Before Projection, 2018, An Inventory of Shimmers, 2017, and numerous contributions to exhibition catalogs and periodicals such as Artforum. Today, Henrietta will speak about three quite different group shows she curated or co-curated over roughly the last 15 years. As mentioned, the 2008 Whitney Biennial, the exhibition Before Projection, Video Sculpture in 1974 to 1995 at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, and that was in 2018, accompanied by the publication I also just noted. And finally, the recent permanent collection installation, which I mentioned, This Must Be the Place, inside the Walker's collection that opened last year and is ongoing. And with that, welcome, Henrietta. I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for joining us early. At least it's quite early here. I really appreciate it, especially at the end of the semester. And thanks for the introduction, Stephen. I thought maybe before I jump into these three exhibitions that I would give a little bit more background on my own curatorial trajectory, even though you've heard the bare bones just now in my bio. I started in 2001 at the Whitney Museum of American Art, but the way I got there was maybe not completely a traditional trajectory, although when I think about other curators of contemporary art, perhaps not so unusual. I was born and raised in Germany, and I went to Humboldt University of Berlin for a BA, MA track, and in various humanities disciplines. I have a degree in American Studies, Philosophy, and Cultural Studies. I studied a lot of philosophical aesthetics as part of that. I saw a lot of exhibitions in Berlin at that time in the 90s, which was really before Berlin became the International Arts Center that it is now. And in fact, it wasn't even quite evident that it would be. I became interested in film and video art and cinema as part of my American Studies program, and I moved to New York in 1999 to earn another master's degree in cinema studies at NYU. And out of that, in my last semester there, I did an internship at the Whitney for Chrissy Isles in what was once the film and video department. There had been a completely separate film and video department that had been folded into the curatorial department. It's in and of itself telling that the film and video department used to be separate, but we'd been folded into curatorial. In the beginning, we had media-specific titles, curatorial coordinator of film and video. I started essentially as a curatorial assistant for Chrissy, was promoted 4 years later to assistant curator. At a certain point, Adam Weinberg took over the Whitney Museum and basically decided that everybody was going to work across media, and we weren't going to have medium-specific titles anymore. So Chrissy and I were toggling back and forth between organizing film screenings and more of a cinema space setting, and then also doing exhibitions on the gallery floors. And that's really how I started into moving primarily into making exhibitions, even though my background and expertise is in time-based media, and I've done a lot of exhibitions in that realm, one of which I'll be talking about. We were always in charge of overseeing the permanent collection, the time-based media and the permanent collection, which is also critical to my background and will become evident in a couple of the shows I'm talking about. I left the Whitney in 2008 and moved back to Berlin and worked at the Hamburger Bahnhof Museum for 4 years. The Hamburger Bahnhof is the contemporary house, as we say in German, that's part of the National Gallery. I left there after 4 years because I got the job as curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center. And then that was in 2014. And then in 2020, I arrived here at the Walker as chief curator in early 2020. And this position that I took up here was actually a newly created exhibition in some sense by our current director, Mary Cerruti, who hired me because in my role, I oversee visual arts, but also performing arts and moving image. And I think the fact that I had this kind of cross-disciplinary expertise was one of the reasons that Mary thought I would be a good choice for this role. We are a multidisciplinary art center. We have these 3 pillars of programming, but we also do a fair number of projects across between platforms. Okay, I'm going to jump into my presentation here. Stephen already said which shows I'm going to be talking about. 3 quite different exhibitions now made, I guess, over a 17-year time frame. First one being the 2008 Whitney Biennial exhibition. I was invited to co-curate this show in 2007. I've been assistant curator for 3 years. It was really an enormous step up for me at the time, the biggest platform of my career. I'd worked on many, many exhibitions with Chrissy, assisting her and coordinating exhibitions, but I'd done maybe 3, 4 smaller exhibitions to my own name. So this was a huge and incredibly exciting opportunity at the time. I was teamed up with Shamim Momen, who was a curator at the Whitney. She ran the satellite space called Altria in Midtown Manhattan, which closed, I believe, in 2010, something along those lines. Some of you may remember that space. So we were 2 internal Whitney curators teamed up for this exhibition. The Whitney Biennial has taken many different forms. Sometimes it's been a team of outside curators. Sometimes an inside curator has been teamed up with an external curator. We were both appointed by our chief curator. And we knew each other, of course, as colleagues, but we really hadn't worked together before. So it was, kind of an arranged marriage that then turned into a really incredible, generative and generous collaboration. And we really did curate this show fully together. It wasn't like one person put in these people, the other person put in those people, which sometimes happens when you have a curatorial team. The Whitney Biennial, curating a biennial exhibition is, of course, a particular kind of brief in that the framework is to some extent given to you already. It's a biannual exhibition. The Whitney Biennial started in 1932. It was actually an annual at the time, and it would toggle back and forth between painting and sculpture each year. And it was a showcase really for American artists at a time when the United States and New York were really not the center of the art world at all. And it toggled back and forth like that for many years until 1970, and then ultimately was made combined. It was made into a biennial in 1973, and that's been the format really ever since. There have been a couple of years the Whitney has skipped a year due to the pandemic and due to a move, but by and large, it's every 2 years. It's when you think about the history of biennials, to some extent come out of ideas of large international expositions. The Whitney Biennial is slightly different because it is, in a way, it has a regional mandate. I know that in the United States, people don't necessarily think about this show having a regional mandate, but it does cover one country. It's a pretty big country, but it's one country. It happens every 2 years, and it has been for a long time billed as kind of a survey or something that's taking the pulse of American art, which, of course, is not completely possible in an exhibition that has maybe at the most 100 artists in it. So within that, people formulate certain themes, strands, but for a long time it was a survey exhibition, and it was one that didn't have a title. That changed in recent years. In the following, I'm just going to go back and forth between some installation views here. I'm not going to talk about every single artist or every single slide, but I might go back just at a certain point to illustrate certain points. So in spite of this, the kind of the survey, the pulse taking that we were tasked with doing, we ended up structuring the show around certain themes that came both out of what we were seeing at the time, our travels, what we were looking at, and to some extent, certainly also out of our own curatorial interests and things we gravitated towards. The essay I wrote for the catalog was called Lessness. I borrowed that title from Samuel Beckett. It was called Lessness, an Art of Slower, Smaller, and Less. And I think it was in a lot of ways a reaction to a particular moment in time, maybe to an extent in a particular moment in New York. The show happened at the tail end of an era that was bracketed really by 9/11 and then the crash of the financial system in 2008. When we opened the show, it was before the crash, but there were signs that the economy was going into a bad place. There was sort of like a lot of sort of an ominous feeling about what was going to happen. And there was a sense that that very high-flying moment with a very intense art market was slowing down. So we were kind of taking that up and combined with what we're seeing in artist studios, focused on three larger interlocking themes, as you will. One, we really were interested and wanted to highlight practices that we called alternative practices at the time. They were really performance and socially engaged types of activities, things that were collective, time-based, often ephemeral, whether these were culinary projects, performances, music, publishing projects. And we were seeing a lot of artists who were working in these modes in a way that was really alongside a studio practice, but as important to them. And perhaps importantly, both trying to elude the mechanisms of the market and commercialization, while at the same time kind of acknowledging its implications therein. I was talking to somebody recently about the show, and they were like saying to me, I think you curated the Gen X Biennial, and I think maybe that was to an extent true. We were also finding, we traveled all over the country. Historically, the Whitney Biennial had been pretty New York focused, that started to change in the 1990s. In our case in particular, we included a lot of artists from Los Angeles, and LA then wasn't, the art center that it is now. It didn't have the same market that it is now. It was still a lot sort of, let's say, a little bit more under the radar than it is now. And we felt, whereas New York felt very interior and sort of anxious and, two-dimensional focused and paintings focused, we felt that people in LA had sort of more actual and psychological space to make larger works. And I think that kind of came into the choices of the show as well. Our show had very little painting in it, which was not well received by certain quarters of the art press. Jerry Saltz called our show something like academic and bloodless, which I actually didn't mind. He gave us a considered review. I also felt then and now that if there's one medium that really doesn't need anybody jumping in for its defense, it's probably painting. you know, the fact, I mean, I should have said this maybe a little bit earlier, but the fact that the Whitney Biennial is kind of a daunting task. You know, your head is on the chopping block. It's been historically the exhibition everybody loves to hate, but I think we both kind of felt that it was actually that there was a lot of freedom within that. If you know that you're going to get criticized, then you might as well do the show that you really want to do. And I think we did that. So, you know, in some of the images that you've seen here, you kind of see that there is, oh, the second theme was an emphasis on modest scavenged materials, oftentimes addressing ecological change, climate change, and decay. I think you can see some of that here in this show with, for example, a work by Ruben Ochoa from LA, who was kind of creating these debris upended street sculptures, a work by Charles Long, which was including scavenged materials from the LA River to make these kind of sylph-like bird structures. Mitzi Peterson, who was using concrete with glitter. I'm taking you from the fourth floor down to the third floor. This is an installation view on that floor. Daniel Joseph Martinez, Carol Bove. And the last theme that was threaded throughout the exhibition was really failure, kind of the idea of an end of empire, of like disappearance of certain grand narratives of modernism, of communism, of 1960s culture counter that was kind of felt in a bunch of the works, particularly film and video pieces. This is the third floor. You can see that by the black stone on the floor, which was cleaned a little bit later, but was a very stark visual element. Then this is a group of works by Walid Beshti. Leslie Hewitt and Cheney Thompson. Here, Cheney kind of made a meta piece that brought his own Whitney Biennial introductory text into his installation. As you can see here, this is not the introduction to the show. On the second floor, works here by Michael Queenland, Michael Smith, and others. That big block in the middle by Jedediah Caesar was a big styrofoam cube that he had had sitting in his yard for years, and he would kind of add resin to it so that it kind of turned into this large decaying gemstone. Yes, but I think this gives you a little bit of a sense of the feel of the show. This is an installation called Cheese by Mika Rottenberg. It had a certain element of austerity. At least to my mind, I thought it was quite poetic and kind of, you know, reflected on what felt like a quite contemporary landscape. We were struggling with how to bring in some of these more ephemeral performative elements into the exhibition, and a kind of really fortuitous opportunity fell into our laps in that we were approached by the Art Production Fund. This is an organization that was then run by Yvonne Force Villarreal, Doreen Remen, and Casey Freeman, who were organizing very large public art projects throughout the city in New York, and they had been in conversation with the people that were running the Park Avenue Armory, excuse me, about mounting a big project there. This was before the Armory was renovated and became a more regular venue for art shows. Art fairs would be taking place there, but it wasn't like a commonly used venue, and they were really trying to launch it. And Art Production Fund approached Shamim and me to partner on this project, and we had this incredible opportunity to turn the Armory into a space that would house some of these more ephemeral events over the course of the show. Actually, that's not entirely true. We did it for 2 weeks in the beginning. It would have been logistically and financially impossible to run it for all 3 months of the exhibition. We invited certain artists to make site-specific installations in these rooms. For example, this was an installation that dealt with the Rapunzel myth by Portland-based artist M.K. Guth that was using one of the historical rooms. But we also invited all of the artists that were represented in the show in general to propose a work for the Armory, and if we could, we would fabricate it. So this year is a neon installation. We deliberately left the big drill hall quite open. It was used for several large performances like a dance-a-thon, a music piece by Marina Rosenthal, some other concerts, but we mounted these neon pieces at the end of it, which were actually reproductions of neon signs of shapes taken from photographs that Gretchen had taken around the Louisiana coast after Hurricane Katrina. So they sort of that testament to that particular both ecological and also social disaster that had unfolded about 2 years before the show opened. MK Guth. This year was a work by Eduardo Sarabia. He also had an installation at the Breuer Building. Of course, I should have mentioned that this was during the times of the old Whitney Building, the Marcel Breuer Building on Madison Avenue and 74th Street, built in 1967, an absolutely gorgeous building. I spent my entire Whitney career in that building. They moved downtown to its current location, which I'm sure everybody knows well, in 2016. Eduardo did a project that's kind of dealt with structures of U.S.-Mexican trade and ran a tequila bar in the Armory, which was both an installation during the day, but then would be activated various times throughout the show here. And here you see one of the evenings where it was running as a bar. Bert Rodriguez created a minimalist cube out of which he ran free therapy sessions for visitors into the Armory. And here you see one other concert in the large space by the San Francisco-based group Lucky Dragons. So this was a counterpart to our exhibition that was sort of conceived to be unmonumental, and it had an even more sort of ephemeral component. It was really quite magical and memorable, but it's not something that is really very well remembered. It only happened for 2 weeks, but I think maybe that's exactly what made it a quite powerful part to this exhibition. Okay, running behind a little bit, so I'm going to move on to the next show. When I was putting this presentation together, I realized that this exhibition here, Before Projection, Video Sculpture 1974 to 1995, happened pretty much exactly 10 years after the Whitney Biennial. And it really had been something that had rattled around in my mind since the mid-2000s, since my time at the Whitney Museum. And I didn't get to realize it until 2 jobs later. Again, I'm going to be talking back and forth a little bit without speaking about every single work. In the following, I'm also kind of taking you through the rooms at the List Center from the beginning of the show till the end. This is here the first work in the exhibition by German artist Friederike Petzold. It's an installation from her very important large video piece called the Nuambandi Sign Language, which is fortunately completely underknown. At any rate, to go back to the genesis of the show, when I was working at the Whitney, first as coordinator and then as assistant curator, we were overseeing the time-based media in the collection. And for a number of years, I did a lot of research and documentation on works that had been in the collection, that had started to come into the collection since the 60s or 70s, really to catch up with the best practices around conserving and documenting time-based media art, which were then were really being more embraced by museums in the early 2000s. And I was really fascinated by a kind of work that had at that time been almost completely forgotten or relegated to the storage warehouse. And those were installations that use lots of monitors, video sculpture or monitor sculpture. And some of these works that I saw from documentation were formally really interesting. Some of them were very quirky. I really wanted to see these, but literally nobody was showing them, and actually almost nobody was particularly interested. That might sound very strange now, but it's worth reminding people that the 2000s were really the time when the projected image kind of triumphantly entered the gallery space. There was a lot of writing around the cinematic turn in contemporary art. And exhibitions, for example, like the 2002 Documenta, which was staged by Oakway and Wazer, were widely noted for its inclusion of a lot of large projective work, including featuring artists that actually had been known mostly as filmmakers, like Ulrike Oettinger and others, that were also included in that exhibition. Also in 2002, in a roundtable for October, Hal Foster called the projected image the default category of contemporary art. So it was really front and center in many, many exhibitions. And what's more, the discourse around this had a very celebratory tone. And really, people were sort of writing about the fact that the moving image had been liberated and come into its own. And by liberated, which really was frequently used, meant freed from that ostensibly very clumsy display mechanism of the monitor or the AV card or the television set, which was kind of tainted by its association with broadcast media, which at best was kind of a platform for the production of mediocre content, at worst, a microphone for hegemonic ideology. So video art, there was a sort of there was an early video art, a real strand of television and broadcast critique, but also kind of reckoning with the formal proximity to television as a medium. This, seemed funny to me, even in the early 2000s, because a large projective installation in a gallery space requires the construction of a whole different architecture, separate from the galleries, whereas monitor sculpture can be in galleries just fine, be put up in conjunction with paintings, with other two-dimensional works, with other sculpture. And that sort of reaction against the boxy television set seems really overwrought now, where it's quite hard to come by. And AV cards are never seen in galleries anymore. And in fact, when the show finally happened, people were really interested in seeing a lot of these works. And in some ways, we've, in all of these intervening years, we've been kind of going back to an era of the small screen vis-a-vis certainly our cell phones, but also the laptop and so forth. And there's actually really a kind of nostalgic investment of the monitor and that type of technology. It was, by the time I staged the show, the technology had become a lot more rarefied. There were some challenges when it came to conservation and being able to show things. It would probably be even more difficult now, which is 7 years on. But anyway, the point of the show really was I felt that those many accounts of video art were incomplete and tended to tell a story that talked about an extraordinarily fertile period in early video art, and then kind of pole vaulted into the 90s when projection started entering the gallery. And I really wanted to make a claim. I wanted to selfishly see some of these works that I'd never been able to see, and I wanted to stake a claim for the fact that video sculpture really was a fully resolved form with its own set of formal and thematic concerns already. We only had, not only, but the List Center galleries had 5,000 square feet, which by definition meant that you can only do a mid-sized show. I had to be quite focused. There were 12 artists in the exhibition. And I didn't necessarily wanted to tell that quite familiar, quite paternalistic story of the history of video art either, but highlight some people who weren't that well known, like Friederike Petzold or Ernst Caramella, who was the artist who made this ping pong table installation here. And for example, I quite reckoned with including Nam June Paik, and you see his his monitor cello playing sculpture here. He is widely credited with being, the father of video art, but at the same time, it's very difficult to not show him in an exhibition that deals with video sculpture. That's pretty much the core of what he did. But for example, I didn't include people like Gary Hill or Bruce Nauman, who are often shown in the context of 80s and 90s video installation. The show spanned some 20 years, starting after the moment of very early video art, and then kind of ended when video projection really, because of availability of certain technology, entered the gallery. I deliberately excluded closed circuit installations, so live, like broadcast installation, because the show was really not interested in thinking about immediacy or liveness. Those were the two qualities that in the early days of video art were often called the essential qualities of the medium. And that wasn't an argument I wanted to make. So in a way, I was kind of excising a group of monitor sculptures from a messier landscape of video art in the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s. But I wanted to make a case for this kind of work as a type of sculpture that was very specifically not proscenium art, not like projected image, not like theater. A lot of this is to be seen in the round. In addition, that video sculpture really kind of coincided with the rise of installation art in general in institutions throughout the 80s and 90s, especially in the 1990s. And that it pursued a number of formal and thematic pursuits on its own, for example, that really depended on the monitor and didn't try to transcend the sort of clumsy display mechanism. One, there's a sustained engagement with the human figure and scale, for example, obviously in the Nam June Paik sculpture, also in the Petzold 4 monitor piece you saw earlier on here, which puts together a female body from individual film body parts of the artists. Also, the ping pong table, which substitutes the ping pong player with a recorded video image of two ping pong players. You can also have two people playing this behind that. There's an engagement with the history of technology itself. For example, Diana Thader in this 3-monitor installation on the floor here, which was the most recent work in the exhibition, actually kind of dealt with the cinema. These are they're images from American Western films that she yanked back to the television monitor and showed in red, green, and blue RGB, which are also the 3 colors that make up CRT or cathode ray tube television monitors. Or a work like this by the German artist Maria Vetter, which was a big video wall made in the late 1980s. That was when the fact that you could have a video wall that would play a consecutive image or break up into different parts was really very cutting-edge novel technology. Her work dealt with the introduction of color television in Germany in the late 1960s and with the introduction of PAL, which is the European television standard, which is different from NTSC, which was the standard in North America at the time, but really kind of capitalized also on the RGB qualities of the televised image and engaged with technology and kind of color symbolism as well. You see Toni Orzler sculpture here from the late 80s. That is one that made the monitor almost completely disappear. You had like 2 small monitors embedded in the sculpture of a castle in a nuclear power plant, which was sort of a narrative, and both of those monitors was telling kind of an abstruse narrative about the nuclear threat. And then, television critique itself, such as this work by Taka Imura, which is quite humorous, having 2 television sets facing each other so that they kind of cancel each other out or kind of look like they're hugging each other. In the background, you see a work by Muntadas, which is called Credits. This was mounted high up on the wall, sort of like you would have seen during the time of its making in the 80s in television airports or certain lounges. And I mean, I guess you still do in airports, only there aren't box sets anymore. And it was a sequence that only played credits from television shows. So kind of a meta commentary on television. And then finally, Mary Lucier, who was and is dealing in her work in the moving image with painterly subject matter, but also quite, conceptual concerns of calendaring and minimalism. This is a work called Equinox, which was from 1979, where she filmed the sunset from her rooftop in Lower Manhattan over 7 consecutive days and documented the increasing burn-in into the camera lens of her video camera throughout those days. You obviously see that think about painting, it has a classic horizon line, the sunrise, one classic topic of painting, and also kind of describes a sequence in time. The entire exhibition was not installed chronologically. As you could see, even though I did put Petzold in the beginning, then Derek Birnbaum second, because that one was also one that kind of literally was a threshold between film and video. But other than that, was really striving to make a compelling, experience in space. And with that, I mean, this is maybe as good a place as any to say that I am somewhat of a formalist when it comes to installing exhibitions. I do think that shows, of course, need to have, an argument or a point to them, but I also believe very strongly that you do have to be able to tell a visual story in space that people can take some meaning from, even if they know very little about the show itself. So this was something that I've been striving for, certainly influenced the way this show was put together. So now I'm moving on to a quite different type of exhibition again. This must be the place inside the Walker's collection. This is the complete reinstallation of the permanent collection at the Walker that I completed in 2024. It takes up over 11,000 square feet, and the old part, 3 big galleries in the older part of our building. And it was actually the project that I began working on first when I joined the Walker in early 2020. But then it was also the project that was postponed several times because of COVID closures and our having to reshuffle the exhibition schedule multiple times, just like everyone else. And it ultimately happened in 2024. Excuse me. Which I think was for the better, because it gave us a lot of time to think about this show at this particular time and in this place, meaning the Twin Cities, and what it should do. It also gave us the opportunity to integrate visitor feedback, which we solicited via a related project that happened slightly earlier, and I'll be talking about as I go through this show. I worked on this, like I said, for about 4 years, on and off, for real for about 2 years, together with a team of 2 other curators and a curatorial fellow. And it was an exhibition that to some extent built on a very specific history of collecting and mounting exhibitions shows at the Walker, but then also kind of tried to position the collection somewhat differently. As I mentioned before, we are a multidisciplinary art center. We have had film and performance happening in our building since the 1940s, even though the formal departments were put together later than that. And we have for a long time collected works that have a either are performative or have a performative component to them, that are interdisciplinary, that are conceptual in nature. We have great depth and minimal holdings. But most importantly, really, the history of the Walker's collection has never tried to pursue a modernist, linear, canonical narrative. It's an exhibition it's a collection that has depth in certain artists and also certain particular mediums and movements. For example, in the 1990s, we, under the leadership of then director Kathy Helbreich, we focused on collecting Viennese actionism. You can obviously see the relationship to performative practices and Gutai works from Japan, which weren't collected much at the time. So we do have certain strength and depths, but there was never any, again, like I said, effort to kind of build that complete narrative. And in fact, when the building with an extensive expansion by Herzog de Meuron opened in 2005, the permanent collection was installed along an idea of multiple overlapping stories. The former curator Joan Rothfuss wrote then that the collection supports the contemporary understanding that one true history does not exist, Rather, there are 1,000 stories that overlap, intersect, and circle around each other. That is something, even though it was 20 years earlier, that felt very germane and really important and actually adequate to the moment too. And it's something that we were starting to think about in terms of, or what we've called a polyvocal approach to a collection, one where you think about a choir of voices rather than, let's say, selected soloists, or formidable soloists and a bunch of kind of background singers around it. But in another way, I sort of wanted to situate the collection more strongly as the collection. Since the mid-2000s, typically our collections had been installed as a midterm or longer term exhibition under a thematic umbrella, under a title. Oftentimes that title didn't mention collection particularly. And I think it was sometimes understand for kind of a general museum goer whether you were encountering a temporary exhibition or a permanent collection. And many visitors, in fact, do have a pretty vague understanding of the difference between a temporary collection display and a temporary show. We actually have data on that from an audience survey that we took on the previous installation, which called 5 Ways In. And you might want to ask, well, why does that matter? Really, but I do think it does make a difference. You wouldn't curate a show with all loans like you do a permanent collection. You put different things in there, different priorities in staging them. And I think, to my mind at least, and this was one of the premier goals with the show, there's also it also has a little bit of a different audience address. We really wanted to think about this as the collection of our local and recurring audiences, of course, to everybody else as well. But I've always thought about a collection as something that nominally, of course, belongs to us as an institution, but really belongs to the people who live and work here, who can come and encounter works and re-encounter them. And I think many people, perhaps in this room, have stories of seeing one work at the Met or whichever museum you used to go to and see it again and again. You kind of feel like it's a work you have a real relationship with. So that was one of the goals of this exhibition. We also wanted I wanted to situate it more clearly in this particular part of our building. The collection had hopped around historically in different parts. We have a lot of visitor feedback that the building since 2005 is quite confusing for people. And if you encounter different shows in different parts of the building all the time, that doesn't necessarily help wayfinding or orientation. Also, a lot of works, a lot of works that were popular favorites were not in the exhibition. Here you see Large Blue Horses by Franz Marc from 1911, which is to some degree an outlier in our collection. Really, our strengths lie in the 1950s into the present. We have not very consistent holdings from the earlier part of the 20th century, but Franz Marc is painting, which is a work that came from Germany that was labeled degenerate by the Nazis, came to the Twin Cities in the 1940s and has been a city favorite ever since. People used to have there used to be reproductions, prints that people had in their homes, and it is the work that people ask about most often when coming to the Walker, and it was also important to us to have certain favorites on view for people. Lastly, we wanted to create kind of a visual and conceptual identity for the permanent collection that would be quite distinct from the other art galleries. And I decided to use the overarching umbrella of ideas of home. I'll talk about that in a little bit, and then have certain what we've called interludes that wouldn't necessarily conform to that, to give us some flexibility and to showcase, in this case, like here, some of the older works in our collections. These are Bob Thompson, Marston Hartley, and Franz Marc, in a section that is called Figures, thinking about figures very loosely, if horses are figures, but kind of showing earlier parts, the earlier works in our collection. This here, Edward Hopper's Office at Night, on the left, is probably our second most popular painting in the show. And here you see the colored walls that are part of the other, first gallery. It's actually either the first or the last gallery. I'll talk about that at the end, that you experience when you come to the Walker. Why ideas of home? I felt it was a framework that was both abstract and concrete, something that virtually everybody can relate to. Accessibility was a big priority with the show, but also some that actually, a framework that about which, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of sociological, psychological, philosophical thinking, and that has some very sophisticated concepts attached to it. You can think about home with respect to your own house, your neighborhood, by extension, the suburb or the town, the city. You can think about the landscape, homeland, which engenders some of the most fraught kind of geopolitical concepts of our day, certainly. And you can think about it more abstractly as something that is a feeling or a state of mind. And so three different parts are overarching umbrellas for three galleries. Kith and Kin, which is this first gallery here. No, I should go back, which largely focuses figurative paintings of sitters that are friends or acquaintances. It has a section of works that are portraits of artists by artists, such as the small drawings by Elizabeth Peyton on the right, and black and white photographs, which you can't really see here, by Hollis Frampton, of people like Leigh Bonteque and Lee Lozano on the left. The second gallery is called City, and you can see here up the stairs that you walk into that space. That specifically is not about the city as a literal imaging of the city. It's thinking about the city in terms of materials, surface, texture, as things that could be found on the street. On this floor, we also included an engagement space, and this came out of an earlier series of very focused permanent collection installations called Make Sense of This, where we would have a juxtaposition of some works and would solicit feedback from audiences on the interpretation, on how they like to learn about work in a museum via a tablet. And we took some of those learnings, which were not a clean data study by any stretch of the imagination, into this. One of the key takeaways was that people really wanted to engage with us. So we designed the space to have different types of prompts. This is the first one where people could draw and respond to a question. We also decided to have all of our interpretation in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. You can see that here with home in 4 different languages, which are the 4 most commonly spoken languages in the Twin Cities, which simultaneously supported a goal to be very kind of both physically accessible but intellectually accessible as well. We really worked a lot on making the text short, plain English, not using any jargon, which was pragmatically very important because it's hard to get 5 different languages on a label on a wall text. In the background here, you can see how that looks with this short section text. We included a section that is called Our Streets, which will be rotating out this summer. And that kind of deals with the street as a site of social activation and protest. This is here Lorraine O'Grady's phenomenal photographic work, Art Is, based, which are photographs from the African-American Day Parade in Harlem in 1979, where she organized a float, Cara James Marshall. But of course, we were really also thinking about our own location of the Twin Cities, and especially, you know, the protests and the uprisings for racial justice that started here in the summer of 2020. And on the left here, you see photographs by a local artist and photojournalist, King Demetrius Pendleton, that documented the memorials and some of the activities and protests around George Floyd Square. We brought a slightly larger number than these into the collection, but we felt we couldn't stage a show called This Must Be the Place, thinking about ideas of home without bringing Minneapolis into this quite specifically. We also have a number of artists who live and work here in the collection installation. And finally, the last section is called Land, and you see how what that looks like up the second set of stairs. One of the goals was to make each of these galleries feel quite different in texture. So hence the different wall colors. I will say that this yellow looks extra buttery on the monitor. It's not quite that when you're in the galleries itself. Initially, this section started out more using land art, but then became somewhat more of a pointed juxtaposition between ideas of westward expansion and then the extraction and displacement that entails in, for example, works by Jim Denemy, which you see in the back left there, which is a late artist Jim Denemy from the Minneapolis area. He passed away prematurely, unfortunately, just a couple of years ago, which is a kind of like a comedic rendering of Custer's Last Stand, which has also been kind of cast as his noble last stand. In fact, was a decisive defeat by native forces of the American cavalry here. In the foreground, you have works by Kara Walker. This is a video room by Rashid Johnson. I know I'm a little over time, but perhaps just briefly, the juxtaposition here of Mark Tansey, which is a very tongue-in-cheek works that you can kind of read on different levels, and Ursula von Reitingsbard was one of the areas in which I juxtaposed these works, which is perhaps art historically somewhat unorthodox, but I think kind of made it quite legible combination of thinking about these natural forms in a two-dimensional and three-dimensional form, something that is very visually accessible, even if you don't know what the artists are thinking about. And then finally, the last section of the show was called Light, Water, Space. Here you can actually see that we have the section titles in each of the gallery spaces as well. This is sort of a play on minimalism and California light and space, even though I played a little bit fast and loose with that here by inserting some more unconventional forms. The space is essentially introduced by Marie Watts' neon piece, which you see on the wall. She's a native artist living and working in Washington State. It's a neon piece that talks about nature, cohabitation with animals, and essentially intergenerational stewardship and care. Here is a number of works that are more associated with historical California light and space, put together with a more recent work by Naveen Mahmood. And then finally, sort of ending with the perceptual magic of Robert Irwin in the exhibition here. I will say last, even though I could have said it first, that the show, in keeping with this idea that you would have a kind of an overlapping set of concerns that you can approach from many different levels and many different angles, the exhibition is also designed to be entered from either side. So that you don't work through anything backwards. I spent a lot of time thinking about sightlines that would work either down the steps or up the steps, and something that would have these two different points of entry into the exhibition. And so with that, I am going to stop sharing. Sorry, I went a little bit longer.
No worries. That's great.
Open it up to.
So let's see if there are any questions. Okay, this is the moment. If you'd like to ask one, please type it in at the bottom of the screen. While we're waiting, maybe you could just talk a little bit about those themes. How did you come up with the themes for that show? And since it's going on till 2029, is that going to develop further? How is that going to unfold?
Yes, I rushed through that a little bit because I was I know I was running short on time. I first thought about we were really thinking about place. We have an interesting double mission. We're an international multidisciplinary art center. We play on that, on that scale. People follow our programming, including people who might have never been to the Walker, but we're also a hometown museum and a mid-sized Midwestern city and have audiences here. And I wanted to make this something that was really relevant to people who live and work here. So I was thinking about place and time, place-making, home. And again, I came to this idea of home because it's quite simple, but at the same time, very sophisticated and also something that everybody could relate to. And then within that, I organized these different galleries by subsets of ideas of thinking about home and interludes, like the figures section in the beginning, which has more historical works, like the Our Streets section. And the plan is always to have this be a very dynamic exhibition that would rotate over time. So we will be doing the first rotation this summer, 12 months after the show opened, where we're switching out the Arrow Streets room and a couple of other smaller spaces and are refreshing them. And we have to rotate out works on paper and photographs. I mean, as you saw, I didn't mention it specifically. We didn't, I mean, there are, it's all mediums together in all of the exhibitions rooms, except for a couple of black box video spaces. So for light exposure, we have to rotate those out. So there's going to be a refresh now, which I've planned out, and I have planned out the next couple of days, couple of years, with some room for flexibility within that. We want to be able to, be somewhat responsive. One of the spaces is going to turn into a recent acquisitions space. And then maybe after 3 years' time, we start rotating over one large gallery at a time and start refreshing it. But that's not fully planned out yet. I think there are a couple of questions here.
Let's get to Patricia's question.
Oh, yes, thank you. So
Okay.
at the Walker, we don't credit curators on the wall. It's actually something that has really been changing in the field. I would say prior to the 1990s, with the exception of some star curators were pretty invisible. And it's been sort of like more, and Stephen knows all about this, sort of the rise of the curator started sort of in the 1990s. Many institutions now do, but we don't. We've talked about it. Curators get credited, of course, in press release and other materials.
So let's just touch on that for another second, because yesterday we were talking about kind of curatorial introspection and curatorial labor. Since you are the chief curator, how do you reflect on that? Why is it, it's fine that it's on the press release, but why is it not something that you are giving the curator more credit for the audience?
It's a very good question. And I mean, we've had conversations. I think like at the Walker, there's been this idea that, yes, I mean, there's one person who organizes these objects in space into a legible exhibition, but it takes virtually everybody in the institution to make that happen. And that, we wouldn't necessarily highlight the curator in the galleries. In my previous job, we always did put the curator on the credit line. I personally, because I am a curator, I'm always very interested to see who curated an exhibition. So I think we are likely changing that. But we've been also thinking about more recently with some projects about really more truly collaboratively curated exhibitions, not just with the curatorial team, but for example, with our colleagues in PELI, which is Public Engagement, Learning and Impact, our education team, and recognizing the curatorial labor that the public programs do. And we've, with the beginning of our current strategic plan, which started in 2022, have really put education alongside curatorial affairs, and we put that at the very front of making an exhibition and thinking about audience and what engagement might look like, rather than to put it in a very, ungenerous shorthand, do the exhibition, hand it over to the education department, say, now find me the audiences for it.
Right.
And, some of that labor is creative and artistic and curatorial. So that's a way in which we've been trying to recognize that better too, which sort of then runs against crediting one person. But again, it's somewhat of an unanswered question at the Walker right now.
All right. Next. So I'm going to read it aloud so that people in the audience know the question. Do you feel you will have the same freedom to show the breadth of practices now that the US has become altered? At least it appears to be so from the EU perspective after the first 100 days, meaning of Trump's administration. You were able to include works that worked with what might now raise controversial concepts? Question mark.
That is a very good question. And I mean, I would say, in answer to your first question, the short answer is yes, at this point, and in our location in Minnesota. We are, in a quite liberal community, and democratically run state. Both of our houses, have Democratic majorities. And we have quite generous state funding for the arts, unusually so for the US. That is not, that doesn't have anything to do with the government. And so, essentially, we are not doing anything differently, and we won't really. That said, is like for now, we don't know if the administration is going to come for the states or state funding, or will decide to target certain cultural institutions. I mean, individual universities have been targeted, and cultural institutions tend to be next in line with, in authoritarian settings. So we don't know, but at the moment, I would say no. We just continue with what we've really always done.
Okay. Next, thanks so much for the insights, Henrietta. I would have loved to see those exhibitions. Which parameters influence your choice of artists you work with for an exhibition if they are not from within the collection? I'm asking regarding the exhibitions which were not the video-based ones. How are you getting about making the connections?
I would answer that question somewhat differently for each of my jobs. When I was starting out, I would, propose, throw lots of spaghetti at the wall, and then would realize the exhibition that I was getting to do. And at the List Center, I did almost all of the shows myself. I had an assistant curator, but the majority of ones was my program, really. Within that, I tried to strike a balance over time between mediums, between artists of different generations, national backgrounds, racial, ethnic, gender backgrounds, medium backgrounds, so that there would be sort of a breadth of things on view. Of course, that is somewhat confined within a smaller space. Now here I oversee a team of 5 other visual arts curators, and then of course moving image and performing arts. And with visual arts, it's really my team brings ideas, brings shows to me. Sometimes something, we need something here that really has more of a broader audience pull, or whatever. But it's kind of striking about a balance, and balancing that with my team's interests. But the goal overall is to to have a program in view that if somebody comes to the Walker and maybe sees this one show here that is a complete head scratcher and they don't know what to do with that, there's something else that you might have your point of entry to. If we have, for example, one quite conceptual exhibition, such as my Sophie Calle show, which happened this fall, lots of text, lots of photography. We had a painting show by Stanley Whitney alongside, so 2 very quite different shows, and that's one of the aspects I bring into the picture as well. I hope that answers that question to some extent.
Okay. Last, Fiona Davies asks, could you talk more about the extent of the engagement programs for this exhibition?
For the permanent collection?
I guess it must be.
Probably, yes. I mean, since that is such a long-term, long horizon project, there are a number of different things. I didn't touch upon this, but the engagement team has been working a lot on what tactile tours, and this exhibition is one of the ones that really uses that, where our educators have a bag that was designed by a designer who does a lot of kind of educational design with different types of tools, fabrics, so that people can, for example, walk through the show. You can't touch a bronze, but you have something on a tactile sheet. So there's a lot of emphasis on different sensorial engagement that is ongoing with the exhibition. The engagement space has had this one prompt where people are responding to ideas of home. We're turning that over into something that will think more about collection, give people a different prompt. There are plans to also bring artists in and use that space for projects, or kind of to just have office hours. We have a somewhat informal artist residency program that we're trying to connect to this. And we have apart from the regular tours and the tactile engagement, um, we bring in artists to talk about specific works at certain times, etc. But it's also supposed to be kind of a dynamic, ongoing thing that'll change over time.
Okay, with that, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming. The roundtable will reconvene in September. And with that, Henrietta, thank you, and we'll go to the student link.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you all for joining.